We're in the process of finalizing our spring colloquium schedule, and we look forward to sharing that information with you soon. This is the last colloquium of the fall. I just wanted to remind you that if you have any technology-related questions, please put those in chat, and later if you have questions for our speaker, if you'll pop those into the Q&A section, that will be great, and I'll do my best to read those for you later. Okay, before we begin, I'd like to just remind you of some upcoming events. Next Tuesday, November 17th at 5 p.m., we're co-sponsoring an event with the Center for Creative Photography. Magnum photographer Susan Maselas, creator of the site AKA Kurdistan, which she describes as a borderless space, is going to share some of her work on Kurdistan and engage in a conversation with anthropologist Dr. Ruken Şengül. Her work focuses on issues of gender, nationalism, violence, and memory and displacement in the Kurdish borderlands. She is currently a distinguished research fellow at the Promise Institute for Human Rights and the Center for Near Eastern Studies at UCLA. We also have 2 upcoming film screenings which double as professional development events. On Wednesday, November 18th at 4:30, CMES will screen A Siege of Salt and Sand, a film about environmental degradation in Tunisia. The film is going to be presented by the filmmaker, Sam McNeill, a UA Minas and Journalism Dual MA graduate. He's now a video journalist for the Associated Press in China and formerly worked in Jordan. And then on Wednesday, December 4th at 5 p.m., UA Minas and Journalism Dual MA grad Hannah Gaber is going to present her film, A Young Nation, The Future of Oman Through the Eyes of Its Youth. I hope you'll be able to join us at some of these events. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Dr. Eve Trout Powell. It's a particular pleasure as Dr. Trout Powell was recently voted as President-elect of the Middle East Studies Association. As many of you will know, MESA was headquartered at the U of A from 1981 to 2019. Eve Trout Powell teaches history of the modern Middle East and of slavery in the Nile Valley and the Ottoman Empire at the University of Pennsylvania, where she is Christopher Browne Distinguished Professor of History and Africana Studies. As a cultural historian, she emphasizes the exploration of literature and film in her courses. She's the author of A Different Shade of Colonialism, Egypt, Great Britain, and the Mastery of Sudan, and co-editor with John Hunwick of The African Diaspora in the Mediterranean Lands of Islam. Her most recent book is Tell This in My Memory, Stories of Enslavement in Egypt, Sudan, and the Late Ottoman Empire. Dr. Trout Powell received her BA, MA, and Ph.D. from Harvard University. Before arriving at Penn, she taught for 10 years at the University of Georgia. She's received fellowships from the American Research Center in Egypt and the Social Science Research Council. She's been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. In 2003, she was named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow, and this year she was elected as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Trout Powell is at work on a book about the visual culture of slavery in the Middle East, which will explore painting and photography about African and Circassian slavery in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her presentation this afternoon, Posing Slaves for the Camera, Race and Memory in Khartoum, 1882, springs from that work. So now I'd like to turn things over to our speaker and welcome her, Dr. Eve Trout Powell. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Professor Ann Betteridge, whose name and reputation I have been hearing about for years and years and years, and we have met at MESA. And I want to thank Julie for organizing everything and Megan for helping. And I'm really honored to be able to present my talk at the University of Arizona. It's a university campus I hope to visit one day because I hear it's spectacular, and we all need some spectacular right now. So with your permission, I'm going to share my screen and get started on my talk. And let's see, share. Okay, and I'm going to turn this into the slide show. Okay, and just if you could just let me know if that is clear for everybody. Can you see it? All right, everyone's muted, so I'm just going to hope that the screen is not silent and that you can hear me. Okay, so my talk is called Posing Slaves for the Camera, Race and Memory and Representations of Slaves, Khartoum, 1882. And this is coming out of a chapter of the new book that I'm working on that has a working title, Anyone with Eyes Can See What You Are, The Visual Culture of Slavery in France, Great Britain, the Ottoman Empire, and Egypt. Soon after the introduction of photography in the second quarter of the 19th century, the eyes of photographers in Europe, the United States, the Ottoman capital, and its Arab provinces were drawn to the bodies of slaves, particularly African slaves from Sudan and Ethiopia. Their ways of viewing these people were influenced by their intellectual backgrounds, their artistic training, their cultural and social upbringing. The gaze of these photographers could be deeply affected by current events in a rapidly changing Middle East, or how much money was being paid by patrons who commissioned particular representations for very specific exhibitions, scientific enquiries, or newspapers. Whether the camera became a kind of social microscope, focusing on racialized types when applied to the bodies of slaves, or whether it mimicked and mirrored highly stylized Orientalist paintings, those using this instrument were in constant dialogue with current discussions of race, inferiority, and colonialism, vibrantly so. Often the viewing of slaves crossed from literature to the camera and back through literary salons and the international art market in which the Middle East was extremely important. The landscape and politics of Egypt and Sudan particularly fascinated European governments as much as people of the region inspired topics for European art markets. So with these next couple of slides, I'm just going to show you some of the more iconic photos that have come out of the late 19th century, turn of the century, about photographing slaves. Here is a little institution being photographed. This man on the right looks like he is a jalaba or a slave trader, and this woman on the left looks to be enslaved. Here is a photograph of young Ottoman eunuchs. And here is actually a very famous photograph of both concubines of the Sultan, actually Abdul Hamid II, and two of the imperial eunuchs. This was a photograph that was actually used in both the Ottoman press and later in other presses, French press, American press, as these poor victims of enslavement in Sultan Abdul Hamid's palace. My talk today explores how a dramatic series of armed occupation and political rebellion in the Nile Valley challenged the narrational talents of the camera. In 1882, Egypt's political movement, known as the Urabi Rebellion, had been put down by British forces who then occupied Egypt. This occupation would last for 70 years. In that same year, about 1,400 miles south in the city of Khartoum, Egyptian and British administrators and military figures were beginning to reckon with the rising force of the Mahdiya, an Islamic rebellion against the Egyptian administration of Sudan. Louis Vosyon was a French diplomat who was sent to Khartoum in 1882 because of his talent for photography. Much of Vosyon's work is still in print today, so well regarded was he for his abilities to chronicle the politics of his times. Vosyon wove his sense of racial identities and difference in his work on late 19th century Sudanese society. So here is a picture from one of the volumes I'm discussing today. In 1884, two series of acclaimed photographs about the races of Sudan had been published in Paris by the French photographer Louis Vosyon. The constructions of racial identity framed in Type du Sudan, and here is the title, and also his other volume, Souvenirs de Khartoum et du Soudan Égyptien, or Memories of Khartoum and the Egyptian Sudan. Type du Sudan is Sudanese types. Echo themes of representations of Black bodies in then contemporary French art. And he paid very close attention to the vocabularies of race then current in Sudan. In 1881, Vosyon, a member of the French Consular Corps, was commissioned by Prince Roland Bonaparte to travel to the part of Africa then known as the Egyptian Sudan and capture by camera the images of the residents of its capital city. Bonaparte, a nephew of the former emperor, played a huge role in the establishment of French scientific institutions, most notably the Société Géographique in Paris, and this commission was one of many whose photographs filled exhibition halls with images of diverse people newly available to French art, photography, and the budding field of anthropology. Vosyon applied great energy to his job and took 108 images for the volume Type du Sudan. This is an authoritative volume in which the most important European, Egyptian, and Sudanese officials were presented, many of whom would later be known as major architects of Sudanese colonial history. But Type du Sudan is not only a who's who of colonial officials. Most notable for this essay, the photographer paid close attention to slaves. Vosyon chronicled the relationships between Sudanese women and their European or Arab husbands, registered surprise at the word marriage when interracial couples produced children, and regularly photographed enslaved people from different parts of the Sudan. The photographer left copious captions, some with the photos and some left in his notes, that show how fascinated he was with the varying levels in which Black people participated in Khartoum society. His other, and I will show you one more picture from Type du Sudan, just so you get a sense of how some of these pictures look. Vosyon's Souvenirs de Khartoum and du Soudan Égyptien, or the Memories of Khartoum, was published in 1882, was a more informal and personal collection of photographs. This volume usually documents his own relationships with Sudanese and European leaders and his own servants and slaves. Here there is less reliance on the staging and settings of the pictures and more natural backgrounds like his home and the homes of his friends. There is a quiet peace in these pictures, a calm Khartoum in which the photographer is shown to be completely at ease with daily life. But brewing behind the pastoral scenes was a huge rebellion in Egypt, in which Egyptian soldiers demanded Egypt for the Egyptians, and an Islamic revival and rebellion that was on its way to conquering much of the Sudan. 2 years after Vosyon completed his collections, the Mahdist rebellion had besieged Khartoum. By 1885, many of the officials photographed by Vosyon were either dead, imprisoned, or sold to the Mahdist armies. So drawing on the two photographic collections and Vosyon's notes, I would like to explore with you today why the networks of slavery figured so prominently and how the bodies of enslaved men, women, and children were staged and configured. As certain as the photographer was about where to place Black bodies in social and cultural hierarchies, Vosyon often expressed confusion when presented with or imagining racial mixing or racial passing. Damage was done to Vosyon's sense of race when he tried to represent what seemed to him the strange intimacies taken with the bodies of enslaved mothers, particularly those who were treated with a mystifying respect. Confusion is mixed with grief here. He felt keenly the power of the Mahdiya. Khartoum would change forever. By the time Vosyon's photographs were published in 1884, the Mahdi's armies had almost completely besieged the city. The relationships that Vosyon photographed were devastated by 1885, making it even more significant that these pictures became prominent displays in European museums and in the French National Archive. So I hope you can see this. This is from Souvenirs de Khartoum, and it can be very hard to see because it's a very, very old print. So I'll try to use this arrow to help. Louis Vosyon is right here in the center of the photograph, sitting. This was taken in 1882 at his residence in Khartoum. The residence is the French consulate, where Vosyon had performed the role of vice consul for 2 years. On either side of him stand 2 sergeants, chawesses, and his private servants, Elmas and Rizgallah. Elmas he names as a eunuch, and Rizgallah as being from the Nuer tribe. Both descriptions would imply at this time that they were enslaved or liberated members of the consulate. This is the first photograph presented in Souvenir de Khartoum, and it immediately introduces Vosyon as the authority with the experiential authenticity. This was both technologically and culturally important. Vosyon's 2 photographic volumes of the Sudan were only the second set of books to be published in France that had photographic images embedded within their pages, a huge technical achievement that only became available in 1880. Culturally, this volume fortified a particular kind of faith in the veracity of the camera. And I'm quoting from Thomas Gazantre. This authenticity of the gaze, reinforced by the transparency registered by the camera, is also the justification of the pact made between the author, photographer, and the reader. I went there and I saw it for you. Vosyon was both author, photographer, and a political official for the French government, and so his dual authority is further echoed throughout these volumes. Vosyon joined the French Consular Corps in 1877, and his first major posting was Khartoum. He arrived at a time of increasing economic and political turbulence. The Sudan was administered by the Egyptian government. In Khartoum, this meant Turco-Circassian army officers, Egyptian soldiers like Ahmed Urabi, whose discontent with the Egyptian government was fueled partly by his service in Sudan, Coptic traders and translators, merchants from the Levant and from Europe, traders in Arabic gum, ivory, and slaves from Sudanese provinces. For years, the Egyptian Khedive Ismail had also hired British officials to regulate the slave trade. And in 1877, the same year that Vosyon arrived in Khartoum, the most famous of these British officials, General Charles Gordon, came to Khartoum, was in Khartoum and outlawed the sale of slaves from the equatorial province of Sudan, what is now South Sudan. The threat of income loss was keenly felt in Khartoum's business networks, and the new law was interpreted as a provocation by the Mahdi and his followers. That it was issued by a Christian British military officer did not increase its popularity. As Vosyon's photos show, the anti-slave trade was not very effective. There are slaves in over half of his pictures. But its fitful implementation threatened a vibrant commercial tradition in which northern Sudanese tribes were deeply invested, like the Dongolawi, the Mahdi's own tribe. Gordon and other officials of the Egyptian government became the targets of the Mahdi's pronouncements, viewed as obstructionists to the establishment of a pure, simpler Islamic state along the Nile. In Egypt, concurrent protests against corruption, financial misuse, and increased European political influence took on a more secular, but no less demonstrative tone. Ismail, the same Khedive who had hired General Gordon, had become bankrupted by the loans British and French banks gave to his treasury. In 1878, he was deposed in favor of his son Tawfiq, and British and French advisors took over the treasury under an office known as the Public Debt Commission. This commission demobilized, without pay, thousands of Egyptian soldiers and officers, leaving them destitute in Egypt's biggest cities and prompting Urabi's movement to reinstate their pay. This means that all of those photographed by Vosyon found themselves in 1882 between 2 significant and growing movements, Urabi's and the Mahdi's, that meant to restructure the political and economic infrastructure of all major locations along the Nile Valley. Through his pictures, Vosyon attempted to articulate the social status quo of these intimately connected regions of the Nile Valley. As in the introductory picture that I've shown you here of Souvenir de Khartoum, the ladders of hierarchy are carefully resurrected in the photographs of Vosyon. Vosyon was a government official fully vested and being paid but fully vested in photographing racial and social hierarchies in Khartoum society. His pictures were dedicated to, and perhaps diminished by, their explorations of types instead of lives. Nor was Vosyon an artist. There is no investment in the aesthetic of the slaves' bodies in his photographs. None of the pathos we see in the abolitionist photography of Sudanese or other African slaves, nor the beauty of Orientalist constructions of African skin color that can be found in photos taken of Ottoman eunuchs like those I just showed you, who had studied in Paris with the likes of Jean-Léon Gérôme. And just so I can refresh your memories about the thrilling palette of Jean-Léon Gérôme, who, by the way, hired photographers in the Middle East to help him construct his paintings. I just wanted to show you, this is one of his famous works, The Bath, 1870, and here you see a Sudanese or an African woman juxtaposed against the skin of the concubines. Here is another Jérôme pool in the harem. This is a little later. This is 1876. And then here, finally, one of his most famous and best-selling prints, the Grand Bath of Bursa, one of the larger cities in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire and now Turkey, which was painted between 1880 and 1885. So this is not what Vosyon was going for, but this is what French audiences were quite used to seeing, as were Ottoman audiences and Egyptian elite audiences, many of whom commissioned and paid for Jérôme paintings in their palaces. So here is another picture of Vosyon's servants. These eunuchs, we've seen them before, Elmas and Rizgallah. They bear a familiar dignity to what we saw in the last print, but they remain silent on the page. They are also tall in size, no hair on their faces, wearing a combination of European clothing, and on their heads, the tarbouch. The posture of their bodies serves as a protective gate, because here is Vosyon right here, particularly for the vice consul photographer himself. Any security granted to Vosyon, a French citizen, would have to have come either from the British or the Egyptian army. There would have been no French soldiers in Khartoum in 1882 unless they had been hired by the Khedive. Rizgallah and Elmas are never shown in any other role except that of guard. And in the more formal Type du Sudan, they are not even named. And here they are again, okay? And there they are, right there. The reader has to use Vosyon's notes and to compare the faces to know who these servants are. And just with a note, I have been poring over these photographs for years. Thankfully, Vosyon left a lot of notes and a lot of captions, but sometimes in these cases, you really have to try to link the faces to previous photographs. There's one picture in however, in Type du Sudan, that bears testimony to the unique relationship that Sudanese eunuchs had to local politics, wealth, and power. In this slide, it's kind of jumping off the page, okay, 7 eunuchs sit, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, posed for Vosyon's camera. The short caption describes them as the principal eunuchs of the harems of Khartoum, but in the longer description describes them in French as Groupe d'eunuques noirs appartenant aux principaux musulmans de Khartoum, or a group of Black eunuchs belonging to the leading Muslims of Khartoum. They embody, literally and figuratively, the power of prominent Muslims in Sudan and Egypt, so worrisome and illegal in the eyes of French and British colonial officials, their power to continue buying and selling slaves. These eunuchs played a very different, much more intimate role within Khartoum society than those guarding Louis Vosyon himself. And the menace of the power of the slave trade comes not only from their bodies, but also in the photographs of Sheikh Suleiman. Let me go to him right here. whose portrait is the first that Vosyon racially characterizes. The caption, and I didn't include the caption in this slide, reads, and I'll read it first in French, Cheikh Suleiman, pour race du Sudan, prévôt des marchands de Khartoum, pure Sudanese race, provost of the Khartoum merchants. But the note to race is important. Although Sheikh Suleiman, through Sheikh Suleiman, Vosyon introduces his readers to the construction of race and religion in Sudan. When the Sheikh appears in print, the same photograph in Souvenir de Khartoum, the merchant is in the same pose, heavy, opulent, and jauntily holding a cigar. But the caption is quite different. Here, Vosyon represents him as a classic Musulman de Khartoum, or Khartoum Muslim. And then the caption goes on to say, provost of the merchants of Khartoum, dealer in ostrich feathers and more or less in slaves, has afterwards joined the Mahdi, a pure scoundrel. This could reflect Vosyon's investment in the ostensible Anglo-Egyptian mission of General Charles Gordon, which had set to extirpate the slave trade from the Sudan. It could also be an angry memorial to the majority of his photographic subjects who were either imprisoned or killed by the Mahdi's armies. But never in either volume of Vosyon's is slavery repudiated. The photographer's mission is completely buffeted by the slaves around him. Also represented in both volumes is the Syrian trader Fathallah Jahami. He was notable for being an intimate of Charles Gordon's until the last minute when Gordon was killed by the Mahdi's forces. But in Vosyon's pictures, he's more notable for his family. Fathallah Jahami married an Abyssinian woman with whom he had several children. In several photographs, he is proudly surrounded by them, even holding his mixed race children who are dressed just like him, tenderly. And I'll give you, so here he is with his wife, and you can see how beautifully dressed his Abyssinian wife, which would mean she was from Ethiopia, and they're holding, she's gently holding his arm. And here they are again, and here he is with his family. An important group of Vosyon's subjects were notable for their own abilities to shift between racial identities, or certainly able to confuse the photographer himself. In some instances, French words like nègre or négresse, noir, arabe, and his translations of them, because he was also fluent in English, into nigger, black, Arab, cannot do justice, as if these words should be expected to the situation he observed. In both Type du Soudan and Souvenir de Khartoum, no one is Sudanese. For Vosyon, black, nègre, nigger, sometimes Arab, are used without respect for the slaves he has posed. They tend to be naked or half naked unless they are eunuchs. So the nudity of servants, slaves, dancers, and those women who are described as Arab, is a signifier of lives lived on the very bottom of Khartoum's social hierarchies. For those who visually look to be people of color, but who are not enslaved and hold positions of power, Vosyon places them more in terms of geographical or ethnic origin. Merchants and soldiers, consuls and doctors are Egyptiens, Syriens, pure race du Sudan, pure race of the Sudan, and du race turc or du race negroïde, of Turkish race or Negroid race. Europeans are Anglais, Grec, and Allemand, or English, Greek, and Germans. No European women are depicted in these photographs. All of the wives shown are married to Egyptians and Syrians and are themselves identified, if they are wives, as Abyssinian or Darfurian, so from Ethiopia or from Darfur. Even the widow of the deceased Sultan of Darfur is posed, but I don't have her picture here. Vosyon shows us Faragalla Adjuri, a mustachioed official with a tall and elegant woman by his side. We see Ibrahim Effendi Khalil, head of the Coptic community of Khartoum, and here he is, Ibrahim Effendi Khalil, as a well-dressed man with a tarbouche and his sons, born, as Vosyon says, of an Abyssinian woman, holding his mixed-race sons closely and tenderly in his lap while he laughs. In the next slide, We see Onorato Musi, a Maltese established in Khartoum, posing with his family, a Negress servant and Maltese Abyssinian children. There is another picture, this time of Habib Khouri, in which Vosyon noted a Syrian and his family, and in the center is the Negress wet nurse. To the left, as Vosyon describes, a Dinka servant, and to the right, an Abyssinian servant. The wet nurse holds the eye. I'd like to take a minute for you to all try to look closely at this picture because it's a really fascinating picture. The wet nurse holds the eye of the viewer. She is bare-breasted. On each side of her is one of Khouri's children. Khouri himself has his arm around her. And this and her direct gaze at the camera are the clues to her centrality in the household. She actually seems to be the household as they sit and stand posed before one of Vosyon's white tents. And I will say that in other notes of Vosyon, he describes the situation of this photograph. The wet nurse in the center is holding a baby while holding these babies whose mother had just died 3 months before. So she really is holding up the household in many ways. The next batch of photographs in Tipu Sudan shifts to only slave women and dancers, as if for contrast to these families. In this slide, okay, and this is how the prints are actually listed in the Bibliothèque Nationale of France. They're on different pages, and then you have to tease them out because then there are larger copies made of these. But I wanted you to see how they look when they're all grouped together like this. This is slave women of diverse races belonging to the chief of the Coptic colony of Khartoum, a man we have seen holding his mixed-race babies close and giggling with them. Like the Sudanese merchant Soliman Bey, whom I discussed earlier, there emerges from this photo an insinuation about the nature of this slave owner's power, this other business in which Ibrahim Effendi Khalil should be named. And finally, in this picture, and this is a picture also offering great contrast, Vosyon photographed 3 little girls, all dressed up in their hair and curls, whom he noted as little girls born out of the marriage between a Syrian Catholic and an Abyssinian woman. And this is a picture of the father of the 3 little girls. These are all types that defy, just by their presence in the photographs, the pure races that Vosyon was hoping to find. One senses from Vosyon a great curiosity about the society of Khartoum, and yet a deep and judgmental commitment to hierarchical racial orders that conflicted with what he hoped to chronicle from the lens of his camera. He came from a society in which social mobility depended on the public adherence to this kind of structure. In 1900, when he was the French consul in Sydney, Australia, he questioned the name of a consul general he assumed was illegitimate in a public and derisory manner. These family details mattered a great deal to men like Vosyon. The captions that Vosyon wrote for his photographs of miscegenation bear an air of the same derision and mockery of the African women's elevated positions. He made this even clearer when looking back at his volumes several years later in his notes. He describes certain African servants as the concubines, explaining that for the Syrian men, polygamy was widely practiced, not officially, but very much present. He went on that the picture of Habib Khouri and his family, and I'm quoting Vosyon, gives an idea of the incredible mixing of races that operates in Khartoum, and that makes it so difficult to conduct ethnographic research. Vosyon's, Vosyon's derision of many of the Syrian, Egyptian, and Sudanese men in the photographs, whether they are Muslim or Coptic, suggests his own racial condescension to the men he considers not to be quite white. And this attitude adds to the sense of hierarchies over which the photographer and his European audience sit on top. And how would non-European audiences have viewed these pictures? The wives of these men, even posing for Vosyon's camera, is a blurring of hierarchies. Muslim wives, Syrian, Egyptian, or Sudanese, would never have been allowed to be posed or exhibited in such a public and open way. As Mary Roberts, the art historian, has shown with her work on harem paintings, many of which were commissioned and bought by Ottoman elites, women like these, who fit more into Vosyon's definition of wife and not concubine, would have themselves have protested, and I'm quoting from Mary Roberts, respectable Muslim women would not pose for European male painters. Thus, European women were commissioned to undertake their portraits. A major priority for the harem women was that these portraits were not to be seen by men. This requirement necessitated that the paintings were entirely executed within the harem, including the varnishing and the framing, and that they be covered at all times. And so the visibility of the slaves and the concubines here is paradoxically a cloak of invisibility to the cultural norms of public behavior and exhibition in the Nile Valley and the Ottoman Empire at this moment in history. So let's go to the photographic conclusion of all of these Black bodies. In Vosyon's society of Khartoum, many of the protagonists we see in the photographs are dead by the time his pictures were exhibited. The photographer continued to keep close eyes on Sudan, noting that the eunuch Rizgullah was sold to Jesse Pasha, who had been an officer under General Charles Gordon, and that Elmaz was sold to Yusuf Pasha, who was a governor of a province of Sudan. These notes that he wrote were also sent in a formal letter to King Leopold of Belgium, a monarch deeply interested, as you know, in the racial hierarchies of other territories in Central Africa. Vosyon showed no record of what happened to the Abyssinian wives and the mixed children of the officials shown in his photographs. They live on unclaimed in his pictures. Even though missing a photographic gravesite, the Black people in his photographs found ways in which to make their own light shine. They used ornaments or hairstyles or touched each other, details in which their humanity defies being bloated images of the Negro as so loathed by the American author Ralph Ellison. Here, I'll show you, this is a group of pictures, and I want you just to see this particular one. And let me close up on it. Here we see a woman who has owned so much of the pose that even Vosyon has to comment. Her caption reads, Fadl el-Anaz, négresse de Sennar, 28 ans, femme d'un juge du tribunal. In other words, Fadl el-Anaz, a negress of Sennar, 28 years old, the wife of a tribunal judge. But in his notes, however, he describes her more carefully. A beauty of the country, wife of the tribunal judge. Her hairstyle shows the universal style adopted by the women of Khartoum province, ribbons and fine braids framing the face. With his hint at her stylishness, the reader can see this beautiful self-fashioning in many of the wives posing with their husbands, in the dresses in which they present themselves and the quiet stillness of their pose. We can see among these women a will to be seen and to be seen correctly. This article, this essay, hopefully serves as a remembrance of their selfhood and their lives untypified by racial categorizations. Thank you.